So in the last video, I was talking about detachment or attachment to sin and why that is such a, why one must obviously purge themselves of these attachments in order to grow in holiness. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about attachment to created things. And that would be kind of the physical items around your home or physical things that you can touch and hold. Tomorrow I'll talk about attachment to, or maybe I'll actually do that today, but I will at some point also talk about attachment to people. But that's like, that needs to be its own separate video because it's very, that's a very frightening topic for people when they hear that they must detach from the people that they love. And trust me, it's not what you think it is. It's not like not caring about those people anymore. But anyway, when it comes to attachment to material goods, I think everybody recognizes that that's not great. Like we shouldn't be, we shouldn't be overly attached to items or money or anything like that. I think as a culture, we all recognize the problems with having an inordinate attachment to items, but we often all do have an inordinate attachment to items. So it's one of those things where it's like, we get it, we recognize that it's a problem, but most of us participate in this, and most of us have attachments to things that are going to cause problems potentially. So the way that you recognize if you have an attachment to an item, is that when something happens to that item or you think something bad is going to happen to it, you'll have an emotional reaction. The goal is to have, get to a place where you have what's called holy indifference to items, which means that whatever comes into your life or leaves your life, you are somewhat indifferent to it, but this is holy indifference. So that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you don't see the value in items, and it doesn't mean that you don't use items, and it doesn't mean that you don't delight in items. So it doesn't mean that you can't see a beautiful painting and appreciate what that means. It sort of means that you see a beautiful painting and you love it for what God has created or what man has created for the greater glory of God, if that makes sense. And so in some sense, you will actually have a deeper appreciation and a deeper love of items, but it's more, it's a love that is more ordered. It is not an inordinate attachment, if that makes sense. So I think we can get into a lot of, there's a lot of confusion around things like wealth and material goods, and especially in the Catholic Church when we see that the churches, most of our churches are very highly decorated and sometimes with gold, and our altars are very fancy, and there's all sorts of material things that we seem to hold very near and dear. So when a Catholic starts talking about detachment or attachments to items, it might be like y'all are pretty materialistic. Like, what are you doing? Right? Like, how can you say that you need to have detachment? And like, how can you say that attachment is bad when there are so many material goods in the Catholic Church? It is like so obviously a very material, like there's a lot of respect for material goods. Okay. And like we have things, we have our miraculous medals. I love this miraculous medal. We have our miraculous medals, and we have our rosaries, and we have all of these physical items that we hold in great importance, like as very important things. And we have sacramentals and things like that. So it can be a little bit confusing when we say that, we shouldn't have inordinate attachments to those items. Because obviously Catholics are not plain people. Like we aren't like the Amish or people like that are, very minimalistic. There's really no call to be a minimalist in the Catholic Church. Of course, there are, these hermits, these desert fathers, and people that like lived out in the desert with absolutely nothing. I mean, that's a thing that exists. And many of our orders, the people are they have nothing, right? So you think about like the Carmelites and stuff, they are very, they kind of have this extreme asceticism that is, they don't have a lot of items. Okay. But for the laity, there is no demand for that. Okay. The detachment from items is more a place in one's heart than it is against the actual accumulation of goods. Okay. So while it is perfectly fine to acquire wealth and items, I think it's the idea is that you have to have the right ordering of those things and to understand the use of them and what they are, what those items are. Um, so, that would mean it's fine to have a good job and to earn good money and to store that money and to keep it safe, for future generations. But if your life revolves around being successful or accumulating wealth or showing off for the neighbors, or keeping up with the neighbors with the things that you own, like what is that saying about your soul and where is your heart in that? Because everything we should be doing is for the glory of God, right? Now, this is this is a never ending battle from what I understand. I don't think that people ever reach, maybe I could be totally wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that like people never reach this like perfect state of detachment where nothing has any, where every single thing in your life, you're completely emotionally detached from, like you have this perfect holy detachment, or holy indifference towards everything. That is kind of from my understanding, is an ongoing process. And so it kind of goes back to these emotions that I was talking about before. When an item is broken in your home or something and you have an emotional reaction to that, you've got to take a little time and like really examine what it is that that item represents to you and what that is doing to you emotionally, and like what part of your soul is attached to that instead of attached to God, and can you let loose of that, and give God his due glory, despite losing that item, if that makes sense. And so I would say so like if something is broken, let's say it's an antique that your grandmother gave you and your grandmother is deceased and you cherish that item, and you might have like an angry outburst at your child if they broke it. That's not to say that you are like a bad sinner or like some terrible person that doesn't love God enough, but like there has to be, you can have that initial emotional reaction, but before you lash out to your child or before you act in a way that is inappropriate, like it's an inappropriate reaction to breaking that item, there needs to be a pause and there needs to be a moment of, I love that item and I'm sad because I miss my grandmother and I am in grief, and God, I'm offering that grief up. This is my sorrow that I'm offering up, for reparation for my sins, for her soul, my grandmother's soul, or whatever you want to like offer that for. And so it's not to say that like that like we should not have any emotional reaction to any goods that come into our world. It's just that we have to constantly remind ourselves of what those items are and what they might remind us of, or like what the real purpose of those items is. I absolutely loved the TV show Succession, which is not exactly an appropriate show, and so I'm not recommending it to people, necessarily. There's a lot of like inappropriate things in there that are kind of ooky. But one of like, and this is going to be a big spoiler, so please don't watch this if you haven't seen the end of Succession. But so spoiler, don't get mad at me. You're watching, and I'm going to tell you what happens at the end of Succession, okay? But in the last season of Succession, the father, so the head of this giant media company, dies. His name's Logan Roy, and he dies. Unfortunately, he does not die with his sacraments. He is Catholic, supposedly. In the show, he dies suddenly before he can receive his last rites. But Logan Roy and his family, like this is the ultimate, it's sort of the ultimate, like rich man can't get into heaven kind of thing. I'm not saying Logan Roy was damned for all eternity or anything like that. Like he's a TV character. But when I was watching the show, I had this extreme emotional reaction to his death and the sadness that his children felt in that moment, because it occurred to me that Logan Roy, this character, he died as this incredibly powerful man with wealth and, just so much power, political power, wealth, and just this huge accumulation of goods. He had everything. He had these giant yachts and these huge houses and women and everything that people think they want in this world. And I imagine him dying and standing before God completely alone and without any of his material wealth, and having to make an account for what he did on earth and who he hurt, if he hurt people, and the things that he did wrong. And he would have to stand before God as just a man. There's nothing special about him. He's not going to get special treatment because he was a successful businessman, because he was politically powerful. In fact, most likely he would be held to a higher account because he is given these great gifts and he did not necessarily use them for the glory of God. And so, that's a TV show that I think like really highlights like the problem with this obsessive accumulation of wealth and power and all of these things that we think we want. So yeah, and those characters are just like so devoid. It's like I was watching it and I'm like, you guys have no, like there's nothing to these people. Like there's nothing beautiful in their lives at all. Like they're all miserable and unhappy. And it's and it isn't because they're wealthy. It's because they don't have a right ordering for their wealth. It's because they're not seeking God. And I think that probably scripture is pretty right when it says that, incredibly wealthy people, like if your whole life is revolved around acquiring wealth and material goods, like is there room for God in your heart? Because that requires a huge amount of work. And it requires a huge amount of scheming from what I can tell. Like you don't just become like a multi-billionaire because you're always doing the right thing and you're not screwing people over. Like you're not doing like shady business practices. I'm not saying that like they're doing anything illegal, but we know that the wealthy in this country will manipulate tax structures and things like that and pay off politicians. And so I think there's just so much to this. And it's like, we all know that, like we all know this, but do we really know it? Because at least for myself, I accumulate a lot of stuff. Like especially if I'm feeling anxious about something or, like I will go and buy things in order to kind of like placate this, like kind of an emotional response I might be having to something, instead of immediately offering that emotional response up to God and kind of sitting with my own sorrow or my own anxieties or my own pride or whatever it is that is driving me to buy things that I don't need. And so anyway, so that's just food for thought. But yeah, so if there is an emotional response to an item, to wanting to buy an item or to wanting to, or being upset because you have to get rid of an item, like really look at that and, kind of try to figure out what it is in you that item is filling. What kind of hole is that filling in you? And then release that item so that God can fill that hole for you. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. And you don't have to feel guilty if you're, if you have things that you're emotionally attached to, that's not something you should feel bad about, but you should, offer those over to God, especially if they get broken or something like that. So anyway, okay, I hope that makes sense, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.